I'm actually really excited today because I've been working for the last couple of years on a particular issue that has had a piece missing. And the missing piece has kind of clicked for me in the last couple of days. So I'm actually really excited. And those of you who were in my class where we talked about the 3 malaises, you're going to be really excited because I kind of made up one of them. You didn't know that before, but I kind of made one up because there was a missing piece, and now I have the missing piece. So it's actually really exciting. At least I think I do. Now, what am I talking about today? I want to talk about cultural malaise, and I'll describe what that is in a minute. The reason I want to talk about it is because what interests me are the things in culture that form us, the formative influence of culture on us, both as Christians and on non-Christians, and things that we share in common sometimes, but these common influences of culture that make us feel and act in certain ways. And I'm always interested in trying to understand those impacts. What is it in culture that's happening? Where did it come from? Because I think if we understand intellectually where it came from, we can start to maybe unpick it a little bit, question it, unravel it a bit, and maybe start to tell a different story from the perspective of faith that will have a different formative influence on people. So I want to talk today about evangelism in terms of these malaises that I think if we understand them, we'll be able to connect perhaps with a culture where we find it very difficult to connect with faith. And if you're finding it difficult to connect with the culture at the moment, you are not alone, because it's a culture that is very difficult, particularly in terms of older models and the way that we're used to doing things. We're finding they're just not working and not connecting. And we can become very negative in the midst of that. What's wrong? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with the church? What's wrong with culture? And I'm much more optimistic than that. I think it's just much more about understanding, well, what is going on? So that then we can start to brainstorm ways of responding. And actually, some of these thoughts are so new that I'm actually going to rely on your input today as well to say, how's this going to work out on the ground if I have something that might actually be right here? So this idea of cultural malaise, I came to from reading Charles Taylor's Secular Age. Charles Taylor is the Catholic philosopher at McGill University, and his very thick book, Secular Age, came out in 2007. I bought the book at the time, and I've been working through it and back again and dipping in and out again ever since. And I just think it's a treasure trove of such wisdom and insight. And what it does for me is it triggers other thoughts. And I love when I read somebody who triggers other thoughts. And so Charles Taylor has done that for me. And on this particular aspect, he talks about how in the development of Western culture, we began to jettison our need for God altogether. And he traces that in great detail through deism and all those sorts of things, the separation of the world from God, a separating out of ourselves from God, and basically through the Enlightenment period and beyond, a sense of human beings becoming much more dependent on our own insights and our own rationality. And as we do that, what happens? Well, if I'm so smart, I can figure stuff out. What do I need God for? I don't need God except to provide those things that I can't figure out for myself. So God becomes the great capital P provider. And in our spirituality and in our church life, God becomes the one, not who is kind of the holder of the whole of the universe, the holder of creation in God's hands, but God becomes the one who we call on to meet random needs. Right? And church practice then begins to reflect that. But this is a long historical process that Taylor talks about. And he talks about it and refers to it in some senses as the great disembedding, when we disembed our belief in God from the rest of culture. And they become separated. They kind of become pulled into different realms. Now, you could then go on and talk about the privatization of faith and all those kinds of things. But I want to talk about what he refers to as the malaise of immanence. So when you have a world and a culture where the transcendent, do you know what I'm talking about when I say transcendent, immanent? I don't want to assume too much, but transcendent being God's sovereignty, his bigness, his sitting over the world and above the world and beyond the world. He's not equated with the world, but he's more than, beyond, bigger. That's God's transcendence. God's immanence is God's presence within the world and presence here. And when Taylor discusses the great disembedding and talks about the separation of and the loss of transcendence, he says that what we've got is not a sense that God is now here in this world, but we've lost the transcendent altogether. So this sense that God is left in this role as provider of random things. And then what happens? Well, we become a world that we can provide everything. In a consumer society, we can provide everything we need. What do we need God for at all then? Well, for very little. And so for many people, the whole idea of the transcendent, a God beyond our present experience, a God beyond our immediate need, becomes something that is completely unnecessary and therefore disappears from our community, our collective conscience. So no longer is there a sense that God is part and parcel of this world. And Taylor refers to an important thing happening in the 60s, and he calls it the Peggy Lee axis. And I love this because I have the Peggy Lee song I was going to play for you. Is That All There Is? Do you know that song, anyone? And she says, is that all there is? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball, if that's all there is. And then she talks about seeing a fire as a little girl, and her father held her, and they watched the house burn while she's in her pajamas. And she said she looked and she asked herself, is that all there is to a fire? And then she gets taken to the circus and all the wonderful sights and scenes. And then she sits back and she looks and she says, is that all there is to the circus? And then she falls in love. And the boy breaks her heart and she thinks she's going to die. And then she sits back and she says, is that all there is to love? Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball, if that's all there is. And she says, oh, I know what you're thinking. If that's how I feel about things, why don't I just end it all? And she says, oh, no, I'm not ready for that great final disappointment. Because I know at the end of my life, I'm going to be looking back at it all and saying, is that all there is? Is that all there is, my friends? Then let's keep dancing. Taylor refers to this Peggy Lee axis as a moment really in our Western culture when there's an acknowledgement, a wide acknowledgement that the transcendent has gone. It's gone. And what we're left with is this question, is this all there is? And the answer comes back quite quickly. Yeah, this is all there is. Now, for Peggy Lee's generation, this is okay, because what's her response to the answer, yes, this is all there is? Let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball, because that's all there is. So she parties in the face of her ultimate demise and no ultimate future, right? If this is all there is, let's live it up and enjoy it. Maybe let's seize the day in a way. But we live in a time, and I would put up a slide that has an image of a Netflix series called 13 Reasons Why. Anybody know 13 Reasons Why? 13 Reasons Why was a very well-known Netflix series, especially amongst younger people. The main character was a high school student who left 13 audio tapes. Get the retro reference because I come back to it. 13 audio tapes. Each one has an account meant for a person of why they contributed to her suicide. She gives this tape 1 to 13 people. And there are 13 episodes, and each one is about the person who receives their tape and their perception of her accusation that they helped to facilitate her suicide. But when I watch this series, and I have to say, it is void of transcendence. Now, usually in many series, you'll find at least there's a flaky New Age person or something, or maybe there's a crazy Christian somewhere or someone from some faith. There's no faith in this series, whatever, not a single reference to faith. That is stark in itself, especially considering the themes it's dealing with, the dark themes and the themes of life and of death, and of who's responsible for whose life and whose death. But in the first episode, I found myself bothered by something that bothers me still, very profoundly. And it was this. There was this retro feel to the whole thing. They've got audio tapes, they're Walkmans. You know, one of the main guys in the series has a car where he has an audio tape player, you know, an old tape player he tucks in. And there's this sense of kind of a retro hint about things. But then one of the main characters says, everything was better before. Everything was better before. And I was really stunned by that comment because that's underlying the whole of the series. Everything was better before. How could everything be better before? Young people are supposed to know that everything's going to be better because they've got a fresh shot at it and their parents and the generation before screwed it up. But we're going to be able to do something better. But no. Here's a generation saying everything was better before. And I don't know about you, but I find that really disturbing. In fact, I was at Queen's a week and a half ago, and I was meeting with a group of undergraduate students, and I put this to them. I said, was everything better before? They just looked at me like I was dumb. Yeah? So what? No, what do you mean everything was better before? Well, I said, well, it was. That's what everybody tells us. Church was better. Life was better. You could be a Christian. It was easier. Life was better. And I pleaded with them. I said, you can't think this. And one guy challenged me and he said, well, you can't believe in infinite progress. I said, I don't believe in infinite progress, but I said, you have to believe that your life is going to make a huge difference in the face of this universe, or we have done you a terrible, terrible disservice, because you need to look at us and say, you guys screwed it up, we're going to do better. Even if it's not true, a young generation has to believe that, don't they? I find it disturbing. Another young woman in that audience said, well, she said, the difficulty with our generation is we have no resilience. If anything is hard, we just walk away. If the course is hard, we drop it. If the task is hard, we don't do it. And if life gets hard, we just walk away. How have we given this message that everything was better before? It can't have been better before. Everything cannot have been better before. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of stuff because I want to dig into these malaises. I can talk about how we got here. It's fascinating, I think, this road of how we got here, and I can talk about that, but I think we just really today need to tackle this idea of, was it better before? Why are we giving this message, and what do we do with it? So when I talk about the malaise of imminence, over the past couple of years, I've divided this out really into several different malaises that I can identify as significant malaises in our culture. Now, when I talk about malaise, I haven't said yet, have I? Malaise, of course, is that feeling of melancholy that seems to seize us in culture, a sense that everything is a little bit blah. Do you know what I'm talking about? And we all battle it, I think, from day to day. I'm a huge optimist, but I can go through life in any given day, and at the end of the day, I can say, meh. Is that all there is? It's so much a part of our culture that we soak it up. And I was, a couple of years ago when I watched 13 Reasons Why, I thought, why is this? What is going on? And I identified first a malaise of distraction. And we all know that we're one of the most distracted generations. Well, we are by far the most distracted generation that has ever existed. And for Christian leaders, we succumb to this as well. And I've talked elsewhere and am writing a project at the moment with some friends in the UK about this distraction that comes to leaders that the Catholics call acedia. Now, the acedia is often translated as one of the 7 deadly sins as slothfulness. But slothfulness doesn't really describe acedia fully at all. Acedia is far more a distractedness away from the task that God has given us to do. So Evagrius, one of the early church fathers, desert father, wrote about this. And he talked about how God gives us a task, something we have to do. Now, for him, it was very tangible as a monk out in the desert, and he had to do these texts and scripts and so on. And he said, acedia is the noonday devil. It's the noonday devil who comes to us in our work from about 10 o'clock till 2 o'clock when it's hottest. And then the clock seems to just never move. Anybody ever experienced that? The clock just, you look and it's just the same as it was, what feels like an hour ago. So the clock just never moves. And so you start to think, well, maybe one of my monk brothers will come and distract me from my boredom. And he waits and nobody comes. And then he thinks, Oh, those people I work with, they're just no good anyway, are they? And then the dissatisfaction starts to creep in with our lot in life. And then we start to say, well, maybe I would be better off with another group of monks somewhere else, or maybe another church, or maybe another set of issues somewhere else has got to be, anywhere has got to be better than where I am right now. And then we start looking at the CBAC list of churches that are available for take-up, rather than stick into the task where we are, perhaps. I think Evagrius nailed it. I really do. And there's all kinds of reasons I could talk about, but I won't today, about why this distraction exists. It's partly because of our consumer culture. It's partly because of our media-saturated culture, none of which I think are bad in and of themselves, but it's the impact, the effect that they have had on us. And so the remedy for acedia, according to the church fathers, is simply perseverance. Perseverance. Well, that's boring, isn't it? And yet Evagrius says, if you persevere, you will find that it wells up to effervescent joy eventually. But you don't know until you've persevered, right? There's the challenge. There's the hard thing. So another malaise, and I wish you could see these, but another malaise that I identified is a malaise of tragedy. Now, what do I mean by that? I think we live in a culture that is simply saturated with a sense of tragedy. And as human beings, we're not programmed to be in a context where we're met with tragedy after tragedy after tragedy without it having effect. And I think in some ways we all walk around with a sense of collective survivor guilt. I remember a couple of years ago, it wasn't even quite that long ago, we watched BBC News in bed, before we go to sleep. Probably not the best thing to do if you want to sleep well. But on this particular night, there was a tall office tower burning. And I looked and thought, I kind of recognize where that is. And it was in London. And live, the office, it wasn't an office tower, it was an apartment building, was burning live, right? You could see people at the windows. Help me, I need to get out of here, banging. People basically burning before my eyes while I'm lying in the comfort of my bed. We are not created as human beings for this kind of dissonance. Because when we see someone in distress, the image of God in us actually compels us to want to go and help. And we reach this kind of paralysis where we see all of this stuff happening all the time, and there's nothing we can do about it. And psychologists talk about that. That's actually what produces survivor guilt on a battlefield. Someone who survives when they've watched their friend die, they're not able to do anything about saving them, and then they have to live with that. And I think that's what we go on in the world with every day. The next night, after we watch people in Grenfell Tower burn, somebody held up a starving child in Yemen. This sack of skin and bones that belies the image of God, faced on our screen, and the reporter says, and this child later died. So basically we're watching human beings die in front of our eyes with nothing we can do about it. Now, when I say nothing we can do about it, of course, we give money, we get involved with organizations and so on to assuage our guilt. And I'm not saying that guilt is wrong. It's normal. It's normal to feel a dissonance between the call for help and our ability to not actually provide any help. So when we say that we have this sense of all the time, of course we do. We've watched people die on our TV screens most days. And we're not programmed for that as human beings. We're not designed for it. It's not how the image of God works in us. And the Germans have a great way of coining terms to describe certain things. So Weltschmerz, you can say that if you want. Weltschmerz is a term that talks about world weariness, just being tired of it all. And we're not just tired of it all simply because we're lazy or because things just take too much effort. We're tired of it all. We're world weary because we've seen more than we ever should. And when we've seen more than we ever should, it's in an atmosphere where transcendence is gone, remember. Transcendence is gone. There's no overarching purpose. There's no one to plead with. There's nowhere to deliver your lament. All you're left with is meh. And how do I get on into tomorrow? I have some responses to some of these things theologically, but I really want to move on to the one that I'm supposed to be talking about right now, and I'm almost out of time. But the third one that has come to me that I think is actually hugely significant for the church when we're talking about evangelism is what I'm going to call the malaise of nostalgia. The malaise of nostalgia. The Germans have a word for this too, Sehnsucht. Sehnsucht. And if you like Rammstein, the heavy metal band, they have a song called Sehnsucht. I have a new respect from you now, don't I? That happened once with somebody when I told them I liked Green Day. But anyway. So this is the one that I've hit on that I think is the third one that completes the picture, this idea of Sehnsucht. And nostalgia is a very interesting concept. Now, Sehnsucht doesn't translate exactly as nostalgia, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. Nostalgia actually is an interesting concept because it talks about a longing for something, a longing, a yearning. Sehnsucht is a longing and a yearning. And it's for something that you can't quite have. It becomes a longing for the longing itself. And in a world where transcendence is gone, it becomes, the sense of transcendence is hammered down and hammered out, and that longing has to be manifested in something. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that being channeled into a nostalgia where we begin to say, right, everything was better before. Everything was better before. And C.S. Lewis talks about nostalgia as being a way of hanging on to a thing in the past that's actually done and dusted. It's over, but it's become a part of you. And because it's become a part of you, as long as you keep it alive, it's alive, right? How interesting is this? The psychologists talk about the significance of it too. And so it comes to us as almost as a desire. It comes to us in moments of music or beauty. But then we come, as Lewis said, to confuse the medium of desire, that piece of music, or that moment in time, or that particular event, with the thing in itself. And he says we have to push past that to find capital J, joy, which is connecting again, once again, with the transcendent. But the push to become those who are nostalgic is significant, especially in a world where, in light of the malaise of distraction, the malaise of tragedy, we are left in this situation of meh. And I have a little meh guy, imagine him on the screen. And the next slide that you would see is a red ball cap with the words, "Make the church great again." Think about the whole Make America Great Again campaign. What is it saying to a generation who doesn't know any better? America was once great. It's not now. It shall be again. Everything was better before. Make the church great again. If you Google it, it's apparently a big campaign in some places. You had the reaction I did. Thank you. But is that not how we often present our responses to what's happening to faith in the Western world? Let's just find those 5 solutions and we'll make the church great again. And when and I think we give this message without the red ball cap to a generation, and we're telling them, guess what? Everything was better before. How was it better before? When was it great? Why is it not so great now? Because I would like to take issue with that. I have a really neat cartoon you'd love. I can't. Come and see me after because it's hilarious. And I can't really describe it in a way that's good and makes sense. But we're constantly telling them that everything was better before. I have a 10-year-old and I'm old. So he gets a lot of retro input. He loves the Beatles. He'll sit in his room and listen to the Beatles and make little Beatle things out of his Lego. And he knows all kinds of stuff about retro toys and everything. And I said to him one day, have we given you the message that everything was better before? And he kind of thought about that. And he said, well, the music was better before. I said, I think we taught you well. And I said, but do you look at the world and you think, it's just going to be okay, that you won't make it better? He said, no, I think I will. And then I explained to him what I was working on. I shouldn't tell you that. I was explaining to him what I was working on, because he always asks and he won't be satisfied with the put-off answers. So I explained as much of it as I could, and I was trying to explain nostalgia, and he said, well, I just don't get it. And I said, that's because you're not old enough to get it. You have to have more space between what happened and now in order to appreciate that nostalgia. And he said, well, I have a yearning to be old enough to be nostalgic. This kid. He'll be all right. But I'm worried about the rest of the generation. I truly am. And here's the thing. Nostalgia is not only for the life of the church, but it's big in the life of the church. So if we say, let's pack people in, we'll have a hymn sing. Right? It's nostalgia. That's what it is. It's nostalgia. It's saying that we're not pushing forward into the future of our desire and our joy, but we're finding it in that one moment in the past that has been almost deified in our memory in some way. And it's not until we're able to actually acknowledge that our Sehnsucht becomes much more future and transcendent oriented. Now the marketers are in on this too. And we shouldn't be surprised, because I believe that most of what we experience in our culture is shaped by marketing, where we are, for all intents and purposes, victims of marketing. I know that sounds really surrendering, but I think that's just the way it works. Anything I've researched on media, marketing, observation, etc., we are almost entirely formed by marketing forces around us. And even marketers themselves say the first step in undoing some of those is recognizing what they are and what they're doing to us. So the marketers are really into this whole nostalgia idea. I would have shown you an ad for Internet Explorer that was all based on nostalgia for the 90s, trying to hit that millennial generation, just trying to elicit those feelings of the products and things that you consumed in those days that gave us, that's what gives us our only sense of collective and shared memory and experience as a people now. That's why it's so effective, because that's what products do. We have no other point of cohesion within our society at the moment, not much anyway. So the marketers actually use this intentionally because they're trying to create a cycle. And so do you often look at the movies that are out and the ads that are out and so on, and you think, really? Can we not do anything new anymore? Well, we can do new things. Why do we not do new things? Because there's money in the old things. And there's this intentional cycle where there's a 20 to 40-year-old appeal that is drawn in cycle. I noticed this particularly when I took my son to see the recent Bumblebee movie, Transformers Bumblebee movie. And it was neat to see this documented by a professor of marketing who said this is exactly what happens. So we go to the Bumblebee movie, it's all 80s references, the whole thing. And I thought, this doesn't make sense, because that's not even the parents' generation, that's really more the grandparents' generation. But what you get is you have this appeal then to the older generation to say, I remember this music, I remember this stuff, this is so cool. And the kid is experiencing it for the first time. But you put it on a rotation of 10, 20, 30 years, and then the kid will be experiencing it as nostalgia in 20 years' time, taking their kid and initiating them into it. So here we have the Star Wars Enterprise, the whole Transformers, almost everything is going on. And the marketer that I was referencing said, watch for 2020, 2021, Titanic is due for its revival. Like, it'll happen. And it's the same way with products then. They've demonstrated that if they can make a tie-in with your sense of nostalgia, you are far more likely to part with your cash for particular products, because they tie you in with that moment that you're trying to keep alive, even though it is past. So what do we do with all of that? My goodness. I would say if we're going to do a biblical reflection on this is all raw stuff, right? So I'm just piecing this together. But when I think how nostalgia might be portrayed in Scripture, it seems to be that nostalgia is the language of exile. And I've argued elsewhere that we are not a people in exile. We are a people called onto the mission of God. We are a people called forward. We are not a people pushed away. And nostalgia becomes the language of exile. Yea, I sat down by the rivers of Babylon and wept when we remembered Zion. We've remembered how it was before, when it was better. And this looking back becomes something we can see at various points in Scripture as the language of exile. But in the New Testament, we don't see any of that. We don't see a longing for the way it was. What we see is a yearning, a pushing forward. I push forward in Christ for the thing to grab a hold of it. And so how do we encourage people, whether they're Christians, and I have to say, I think this is a message first to the church. We're not going to be able to connect evangelistically with people until we've sorted this piece ourselves. Because we're so stuck into that period of nostalgia of wanting to make the church great again that we're actually not able to let new things live. One of the most exciting books I've read recently is Insider Jesus by William Dearness. And it's fascinating because Jesus is making himself known within movements without anybody coming and even bringing the message evangelistically to them to begin with. What would it look like in this culture if Jesus appeared to a generation who is not connected with the church? Would we even recognize it, and would we want to? But I dare to be excited enough to think he could do that. And I'd like to think we would celebrate that and nurture it and work with it. Stop preaching, Anna. And then I would, of course, now if I were doing a refined presentation, I would talk all about what it means to really spark joy. But all of these things are just droplets of the longing and the desire that we have. For C.S. Lewis, this was a whole argument for the existence of God, the argument from desire. That he suggested that God hasn't created anybody with any longing or desire, that he hasn't created a means of fulfillment for it. And so if we can witness that in all kinds of ways, through hunger and thirst and relationship and so on, then we can understand that this deep desire, what he calls joy, this capital J, joy, must also have a place of fulfillment. It comes to us as an ache. Have you ever seen some beauty so much that it hurt? I said that in the fall. I remember I posted a Facebook post that said, "It's so beautiful in the valley today, it hurts." You know that feeling? That's the transcendent. Stirring up a longing after longing within us. And I think there's a significant point of connection there if we can dig out of our nostalgia and start to look at what a positive and forward direction for our Sehnsucht might actually look like beyond a consumer age that is so distracting. And here's what I think is the best news about it when I think about it. And I'm going to stop, Steve, because I'm going to just go on and on. Was the church really better before? I mean, churches were big and full, and Western society had a lot of, it was okay to be a Christian. It was easy. Is that better? I'm not sure that's better. When I think about, for example, the way that racism was endemic in our culture and in our churches. And we didn't care, really. That's not better. And people will say, but, it's all a bit of a mess now. It's difficult. Well, yeah, it's difficult because we're facing some of the things that weren't right. So when I think of that, I would have had the clip, but there's a show in Netflix. It's about an Indian guy and his friends and family and stuff, and there's episode 4 in the first season. There's a whole montage of nostalgic references on North American TV of Indians presented on television. And the point he's making is every single one of them were white. So here's your nostalgia. Wasn't that great? Well, maybe it wasn't so great after all. And so we have an opportunity now, for example. Is it a mess, our relationship with Indigenous peoples? It sure is. Was it a mess before? We just didn't recognize it. Were we racist? Are we racist? Is this a problem? It sure is. Were we racist before? We just didn't recognize it. So I think it's important for us to say it might feel a mess because we're actually getting better and not worse. And if we take the church universal seriously, we know that the church in the developing world and the rest of the world, the majority world, is growing and thriving, leaps and bounds. It's we who are struggling. So was it better before? Not convinced. If you were a poor person anywhere in the world, it's never been better before. Never. And I'm not Pinker, the atheist Pinker, he talks about how great everything is in the world today. Not everything is, but there's a lot that's better. And I think we have got to dig ourselves out of this pit of a negative downward spiral that says everything is wrong now and everything was better before. And I think as we do that, we'll be gifting the generation that comes up behind us to say, right, now we're behind you. What do you need to do to reach this generation for Christ? But we got to let go of the nostalgia. I'm going to stop now, Steve, and hand it over to you.
So I have to think a bit about evangelism and the changes taking place in our world from a sociological lens. And I want to begin just with a couple of recent experiences. So 3 weeks ago, I was invited to go to the University of Wisconsin. I was one of a group of 18 people who were invited. Well, I say that some of them were from the University of Wisconsin, so probably a group of about 12 were invited. 5 of us were there as Christians. We were representing evangelical, Roman Catholic, and mainline Christianity. And we were there because, I guess, of expertise with regard to digital media and how that affects religious groups. There were also a group of engineers there, people who were involved in the development of various internet things. And really, as they were talking about sort of the next generation of the web, Web 4.0, and what that was going to bring, and so on. But they were really focused. The university was the group that had brought us was focused on developing apps, new apps that would respond to the search for meaning, I would say, that is taking place in our society. And they're doing this very much from the point of view of employers and particularly insurance companies who are concerned about the effect on people's health when they cannot find meaning in life. So they're looking to develop apps, and they wanted 5 of us as Christians to come and help them to understand a bit about Christianity. So it was an amazing 3 days with some amazing people. The primary engineer of Intel was there. Another fellow who does web work for the World Bank was there. It was just an amazing group of people. But I thought to myself, this is like spiritual Disneyland or something. This is a place that would not have existed a few years ago. So I'm looking around the room at people who are talking about their interest in Buddhism and their interest in Islam and their nostalgia for Christianity that was really something that was true of their parents' generation but not theirs. And here were the 5 of us to tell these people about Christianity. I'm thinking to myself, probably if they'd just gone to the church down the street, they would have learned quite a bit. But of course, the truth is, none of them were going to the church down the street. These were people with tremendous intellects and tremendous interest in spirituality. But they needed some people to come to explain some very basic things about Christianity to them, which I think is generally true in our society today. And yet, I think it's also true that people in our churches do not understand that change, do not understand that that change has taken place. Many people in our churches still think that we live in a, at least nominally, Christian culture, that most people understand and believe basic Christian tenets when they don't. Christmas this year, had a group of 27 people come to our house. Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and some Christians. And again, I remember sitting in my living room, and a young man from Asia just reached over to me. He says, well, you know, I'm Muslim, but I'm interested in this Christian thing. And I thought to myself, this is just surreal. That here I am, like I haven't had to say, now I want to talk to you about Jesus. I'm just here eating dinner with people who want to know about Jesus. And once again, I think that many people in our churches don't understand that change either. They think, how do we keep these people out of Canada? We don't want them to come and infect us. We're afraid of them. When in fact, there are people who are wanting to hear about our Christian story. Daniel Bell, sociologist, a number of years ago, talks about meaning, and he talked about the way in which our culture, any culture, produces a certain group of questions about life. And those questions are pretty much universal. They may change in some ways, but those questions tend to be universal. And he says religion is a response to those questions. And as he looked at the changes taking place in Western culture, he noted a paradox that he said secularization may be the means of the revitalization of religion. In other words, our nostalgia, our unwillingness to let go of the past may in fact be the main reason why decline is taking place in our churches. And in fact, in order to get past that, secularization may in fact be a means of bringing about religious revitalization. Because what Bell was saying was that people will always have these questions, and they'll always be seeking meaning. And when the church is not providing answers to those questions, when the church is not a source of meaning, then it's going to have to decline in order for something new to take place. So he asserts that in this time of great social change, the decline of religion as it's currently being experienced in the West is a necessary prelude to religious revitalization. Humanity's questions about meaning are and will be quite different in a digitally connected, globalized, postmodern world than they were in the 19th and 20th century industrialized modernity. And I think he was suggesting that churches are still pretty good at answering 19th century questions. We need to be able to answer 21st century questions. So, I think we are just beginning to understand what we don't understand. I think we're just beginning to understand what we don't understand. Let me give you some examples. Secularism, for example. I think we're beginning to understand that the roots of secularism are not at all what we had supposed them to be. Strangely, and all kinds of sociological surveys have shown this, secular people still consider spirituality to be very important. In fact, there have been some interesting studies that suggest that some secular people who say they have no religion consider spiritual things more important than some people who go to church every week. For some people, the reason they don't go to church is because they think that church is too trite. And they think these things are so important. I look at, for example, the fear that many Christians had not that many years ago when the new atheism hit. Oh, it was going to take over the Western world. What's been interesting to me has been the response of many secular people. Their response has almost been stronger than the response of Christians. To say, this is not the road where we want to go. Meaning still matters. Spirituality still matters. I've just started getting my students this year to read Crystal Manning's book, Losing My Religion. It came out in 2015. It's a sociological work that that looks at her life really, as a parent with no religion, raising children in this world. And for us as Christians, instead of seeing unchurched people as sort of the enemy, to begin to understand them and to begin to understand their spiritual seeking is so important if we're ever going to be able to share the good news of Jesus with those people. I think of the panic with which some people have had as they've described postmodernity to me. What are we going to do as a church in a world where people are rejecting modernity? And once again, postmodernity, I think, is something not to be feared, but to be understood. What has brought about postmodernity if it isn't a dissatisfaction with the modern world? Postmodern attitudes create new opportunities to share the good news, but not in traditional ways, not in programmed ways. I think we can be excited about the spiritual openness that accompanies postmodern attitudes. And I think we're just beginning to understand the role of the church in evangelism in the 21st century, which means, I think, looking in two directions simultaneously, both inward and outward. And I think we look inward and outward now, but in the wrong ways. The inward look needs to identify ways that churches and their leaders need to change. It's uncomfortable. It will require honest conversations about what traditions, what attitudes, what ideas, maybe even what buildings are no longer effective and may be hindering the gospel. The outward look is to get to know our neighbors, the vast majority of whom do not attend any church. It will require, for us to really get to know our neighbors, it will require humility and vulnerability, because we're not going to get to know them until we let them get to know us. It will require our time and our hospitality, both individually and corporately. We will need to listen and to learn. And I'm not sure those have been our strengths. We need to listen and we need to learn. I think we need to see this time in history as a time of transition. In a remarkable way that I think is, I suppose there are always transitions taking place between generations, but I think this is a remarkable time of transition, an unusual time of transition, which means that the Christian church will change. It will change. It's not a time of incremental change. And this is very difficult for pastors, for churches. I think for many churches, they're willing to say, let's think about some small things we can do that will bring the young people in, or however they phrase it. Let's think about some small things we will do. But the truth is, our society is not going through a time of incremental change. Our society is being transformed. It is a different society that we live in than existed just a few years ago. For the church, that means it's not a time of incremental change. It's a time of transformation. I think it needs to be a time of wise transformation, informed transformation. But it is a time of transformation. I think that no one knows the kind of church and what kinds of congregations are going to thrive in this new digital age that we are entering. Because, of course, we don't even know what the digital age is going to become. We know what has happened very quickly in the last, not very many years. Imagine if as much change takes place in the next 15 years as has taken place in the last 15 years. So that means as churches, we need to be quite nimble. I think, and this is purely my opinion, but I think it strongly, I think that we're in a time where we are seeing some interim, what I would call interim forms of churches. So for example, the megachurch. A lot of focus has been placed on the megachurch movement, the growth of megachurches, which of course use digital media. In fact, many megachurches couldn't even exist without digital media. They have multi-site and so on. I have a feeling that's an interim form. I think it's a time in which churches are finding ways, finding their way in the midst of changes that they don't understand. But mega churches are mega programmed, if I can put it that way. Mega churches require an immense amount of organization and administration and programming. Mega churches depend on small groups, but they're not small groups that happen sort of organically. They are small groups that have to be programmed and organized and led in a variety of ways. They are not sort of a natural form. And believe me, I'm not criticizing. As I say, I'm very thankful for the fact that these megachurches have arisen in many ways. But I think I think the megachurch is one of those interim forms. Strangely, at the other end of the spectrum, I look at all this talk about house churches these days. And I have a feeling they're also going to be an interim form. And one of the reasons I say that is because I think that, for one thing, I think both mega churches and small house churches have serious problems or have the potential, and in many cases more than the potential, of serious problems with the abuse of power. And I think we've seen that at both ends of the spectrum, where the mega church becomes so, as the saying goes, too big to fail, that it becomes a place where it's easy for people to be abusive using the power that they have. And similarly, house churches. I think there's been a fair amount of research to show that they also can be places where there's a fair amount of abuse can take place, because we live in a sinful world. But we're learning, I think, during this transition time, we are learning from both of these forms, while the church comes to grip with the massive social changes that the West is currently facing. 12 years ago, I heard Roger O'Toole, who was at the University of Toronto. He was doing a session at a sociology conference where he was comparing church statistics in the UK with church statistics in Canada. And his argument, if I can oversimplify it, was that we might be following the UK example, and he used the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy, church decline as self-fulfilling prophecy. And so in this time of transition, we have focused, and I see this over and over and over as I meet with churches and church leaders, and even as I teach students, we have focused on decline. We have focused on everything that's wrong with churches, and even the language we use, it's church pathology. That's what I would call it. It's pathology. Listen to the language we use. We have diagnostic tools to use when we go to look at church decline. So our focus is everything is bad. Everything is sick. Everything is unwell. And so what O'Toole was suggesting was that church decline actually has become a self-fulfilling prophecy in the West. That we have taken church decline for granted. How many of us here today are expecting that next year 10% more people will be in church, whatever that might mean? Again, we are living, I think, in a day when many Christians, when I think probably most Christians, are expecting decline. And we make our plans based on that expectation. I remember being doing a survey in a church in Missouri, and I visited after I'd done their survey. I stayed for their quarterly business meeting. And as the chair of the finance committee gave a grave report about the future, The comment he was making was, things are bad now, but we need to put money aside because it's going to get worse as the decline continues. In many churches, perhaps that wouldn't be vocalized, but it's the attitudes that's there. Church pathology. I think O'Toole was right. I think we are so focused on problems, on this pathological view of the church, that we are diagnosing our ailments, that we ignore the resources that God has given to the church for this time in history. How many churches are looking at what our strengths are looking at the people in the pews and the ways in which we are able to connect with people, whether through traditional means or through digital means. We've become focused on decline to the extent that we do not expect anything else. And then I've simply written down here, the gospel of morals needs to die. I think another issue that is still difficult for us is that the church in the 20th century reached the place of great moral influence. And I'm not even sure that that was a good thing in many cases. But a sense that we could police moral behavior, or we could get the authorities to police moral behavior for us. Well, that was certainly Jesus' main concern, wasn't it? Oh, no, that was the Pharisees, wasn't it? And my concern is that we've begun preaching a different gospel than is taught in the New Testament, or at least that the people whom we need to reach with the gospel are hearing a different gospel than the gospel of grace for a sinful world. And so, consequently, we should not be surprised when those moral strategies actually make society somewhat worse instead of better. Because I'm afraid that is what has happened in the West during the last century. When we stop preaching Christ, there is no hope. So let's think again about Daniel Bell and what he says about meaning. And actually, I'm going to look at Emmanuel Castells in a moment as well. The Pew Research Center, just before Christmas, came out with a study. It's a United States study, but a large study, that asked people what provides them with a sense of meaning. So I'll just talk about two sets of statistics here briefly. The first question was open-ended. They gave no prompts, no suggestions. They said, what provides you with a sense of meaning? And here were the answers that people gave. 69%, and again, these will add up to more than 100 because people could give more than one answer. 69% of people said family. 34% said career. 23% said money. 20% said spirituality and faith. Well, we came in fourth place. Friends at 19%, activities and hobbies at 19%, health at 16%, home at 13%, education at 11%. Things that provide meaning. Secondly, the Research Center asked specific questions. So they gave a list of 19 things and asked, actually it's an entirely different group of people, they asked a different group of people to choose which things provide a great deal of meaning, and then to choose the one thing that provides the most meaning. What's the most important thing for meaning? And so once again, we see that 40% of people said that family is the most important source of meaning, and 69% said it provides a great deal of meaning. So that was certainly the clear winner. In terms of what provides a great deal of meaning, being outdoors, a walk in the woods, 47%. Spending time with friends, 47%. Caring for pets, 45%. Listening to music, 44%. Reading, 37%. Your religious faith, 36%. Your job or career, 34%. Now, to be a little more positive, if I look at the question, what is the most important source of meaning, 40% said family, 20% said your religious faith, and that was the second highest number. So in terms of what's most important, at 20%, religious faith came in second. But in terms of what provides a great deal of meaning, it came in seventh. That surprises me, and maybe it shouldn't, but it still does. It surprises me that in an open-ended question, the third top answer was money provides meaning. But it probably shouldn't surprise me because we live in a consumer culture. We live in a culture where we are bombarded with billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of propaganda to tell us of the things that we need, and they are all things that money buy. So, that is the world in which we seek to share the gospel. So think about your community, think about your neighbors. Where does spirituality and religious faith fit on their priorities? I think also there's a profound lack of understanding and a misunderstanding and a miscommunication of the Christian message. So as our world changes, and many Christians don't understand that, there's also a misunderstanding from those people around us of what our message is. And I think we may seriously underestimate the extent of the lack of understanding or misunderstanding of the Christian message. Sometimes even Christians do not understand and therefore miscommunicate the message. There's this thing called the internet. It is filled with misinformation about the gospel. So I think many Christians miscommunicate the message with the best of intentions. And I think many Christians think that they know what Christians believe. Many people, rather, think they know what Christians believe, and they do not. And so that means as we teach the Bible within the church, as we share the good news outside of the church, it's really important that we're aware of that lack of understanding. So, once again, how many church members do you think could communicate the gospel with someone who has no understanding of the Christian faith? Are we equipping people in our churches to do that? How many church members can communicate the gospel with someone with little understanding of the Bible or of the Christian faith? When I was growing up, I was taught the diagnostic questions to ask. If you were to die tonight and you were to meet God, do you think you'd go to heaven? If God said, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you answer? Those are the two diagnostic questions. Imagine asking that of your neighbor today. I mean, you're either going to get a deadpan look of, what is heaven? What are you talking about? Or, worse. I also think of the various little pamphlets that we had that showed a nice little diagram. God in His holiness on one side. Humanity and our sin on one side. And the cross in the middle so we could walk across to God. Those things no longer have meaning either for Christians or for our neighbors, because we don't live in a culture where those Christian ideas are part of what people learn. They assume far too much prior knowledge of the Bible, and frankly, they are less than the full gospel. So how many church members can communicate the gospel with someone with no understanding of the Bible? As churches, as pastors, as leaders, we need to begin training people for the world that we live in today. I'm going to finish up by suggesting that the digital revolution is actually a common thread through many of these things. In fact, I think pretty well everything I've talked about is affected by the digital revolution. And I think of social theorist Manuel Castells, who really argued that the digital revolution is at the heart of the major changes in society, everything from secularism to postmodernity, to the search for meaning with a focus on consumerism, to the demand for authenticity, to the misunderstanding of historic truths. Castells says, in a world of global flows of wealth, power, and images, the search for identity, collective or individual, becomes the fundamental source of social meaning. And so in this new digital world, to be effective in sharing the good news, churches will need to understand how people in society are being changed by their devices. Changes in our programs, changes in the style of how we do things, changes in congregational forums will not be enough in the long run. I mean, in the interim, we may need to do some of those things, but in the long run, churches need to be transformed in greater ways than that. And I think I will come to a stop at that point and give an opportunity for perhaps some dialogue between the two of us and some questions from all of you who are here. So, just while you're thinking of some questions, I have a couple of questions for Anna that I want to ask. Well, I really think what you said about nostalgia is important for us to hear. I think back, this is a number of years ago now, I was the pastor in Woodstock, and the old county courthouse, a beautiful historic building in Woodstock, they had, at that time, they had a sort of community Christmas concert that was there. And I remember going, and at the end of the evening, which had been, I mean, just my heart was, it was lovely. And I remember one of my deacons sitting beside me turned to me and said very wisely, "So this is how people who aren't Christians find meaning in Christmas." It was a night of nostalgia that was sort of a substitute for real worship, if I can put it that way. And what I've thought since then, as I have attended many worship services, is I'm not sure that that isn't true in many of our churches, where our worship is more about the nostalgic feeling we want to get than it is about actually anything transcendent that's taking place. So I just am curious about any comments you'd make about nostalgia and worship.
Well, I'm reminded of something that Stan Grenz said, and he said that when we preach or we're leading a service, it's important to remember that most people in the congregation are not there with the fascination of a theologian, but they're there from the memory when the gospel once struck like lightning, and they never forgot. So in a sense, if that's what people are doing in church, then it's a nostalgic exercise to begin with. But I can't help but think that if it struck like lightning once, then are they really not getting any more lightning ever again, or light of any kind? Then that's problematic, it seems to me. So why are we not attempting to facilitate a place where that lightning can come to bear more even light into the path forward and so on? So I don't think Gran said anything about that afterwards, but except to talk about, I think, the community of God and what it is to be and living in community and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy to foster that. And also with the separation, when Taylor talks about the disembedding and all of that, part of that is a separation from external to internal selves. So it used to be, you kind of look for meaning out there somewhere, and now it's all internal. And not only is meaning internal, but it's projected rather than received. And what do we do when we have 100, 200, 300 people in a congregation, all who want to project something different? I think it becomes very difficult. So we probably gather around the lowest common denominator, which is some kind of nostalgic experience. It seems, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, my thought is not that well developed, other than I think that our churches need to be aware of it. I think that's the first thing, that we need to help people to be aware of that. I think pastors need to be aware of it, and I think we need to challenge people in the pews. Are they really worshiping God, or are they trying to just feel like they did 10 years ago when something exciting happened in their life spiritually? I mean, I don't think nostalgia is all bad. I think, for example, of baptism or the Lord's Supper. I think that there are times when we are reminded, when someone's baptized, that may be a great moment to remember our baptism, our conversion, or our family members, or whatever it might be. So I think it's not that I think nostalgia is a bad thing. My concern is that for some Christians, it's become all they have. And so I think they need to be challenged. So because for anyone who is outside of the faith, they don't see that at all. So I think of, and again, pardon me for sounding judgmental, but I've attended churches when I'm doing surveys. I don't know how to describe it. I just think the service was awful from beginning to end. Just painful. You think, how do these people stand being here for this whole hour? It's just, nothing is done well. And at the end, I'd have these dear people come up to me and say, "Don't you just love our little church? Wasn't that the most wonderful service?" And you want to smile. But because for them, there's something nostalgic that I'm sure was meaningful. But for anyone who's new, and I'm there as a Christian. Imagine somebody who's not a Christian, or me, or even their own children, for example, growing up there, and not having those connections. It just seems bad. Yeah.
There's nothing to connect to.
Right, right, yeah. Questions that you folks have?
Can I ask you a question? A lot of what we've been talking about is the result of our thinking and research I hope that what we have the opportunity to think about and meditate upon is for the church. So does it connect with your experience? Because if it doesn't, then we need to go back to the drawing board. If it does, then I would love to hear from you, for example, on the whole idea of nostalgia. I'm torn between saying, let's think about ways then we can connect with nostalgia and then introduce people to transcendence. Or do we need to kind of hit nostalgia on the head and say, be done with it, and let's find, the new thing in order to reintroduce transcendence to people. So, what are you thinking about that? Anybody? Help me out. I don't know. Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, folks are online.
So this isn't on even.
It is.
It is? Okay. My church just did a 30s to 50s night where the pastor's express thing was to thank people for being part of the church that are in that age group. But it was complete nostalgia with an overhead projector and As the Deer Panteth and all the songs from the 80s. And people dressed like 80s. It was like, it was a lot of fun, and people had this, like, the nostalgia was so thick, right? So I think that there was something amazingly connective about it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I walked away feeling like it wasn't what I expected. But, and I now have been caused to think through, what if people are attending Sundays out of a sense of how things have always been for them? It's a nostalgic touchstone to when it was better. And then I fast forward to that to a comment that was made recently at a pastor's conference I was at, was, when was the last time you heard a sermon about the second coming? Or the other one was, what about miracles and like, I'm moved incredibly by the amount of times that Jesus heals people and performs exorcism when he's out proclaiming the gospel. So I can see that it's very much resonating with me, but I don't know what the answer is. But I know deep down I kind of want to blow up Sundays completely because they revolve around a sermon. And most people don't sit and listen for half an hour for a monologue for very long at all anymore. So I don't know what the answer is, but it is resonating big time.
Thanks for that, Mike. I remember when Roy Pointer first came here, and yeah, and he could. I mean, there's cemeteries issue, but he couldn't get over why our Atlantic Baptist churches, for those of us who are in that family, and so you can criticize what you love, right? Because you want it always to be better. But he said he didn't understand why so many of our churches, people would turn up in Victorian dress all the time. And so we went through, I think it's not so much now, but we went through a time in sort of the 80s, 90s, where there were all these celebrations in churches all the time where people dressed up in Victorian costume. And I mean, what is that but nostalgia? And in some ways, I'd enjoy the 80s thing a lot more, but what is it? Like, what is the point to it other than to say those were the glory days, you know? How are we going to hand on something different to the next generation that is not, you know, well, it was better before, but good luck to you. You know, I mean, we have to be able to do better than that.
You know, I'd say, at least in your example, it was named as nostalgia.
Right.
My bigger concern.
When they don't know.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
Thank you. I'm interested in the role that celebration plays in the whole evangelistic outreach enterprise. I mean, when you take a look at the Old Testament, celebration played an important role in community identity and in community growth. I take a look at the church. We have a certain number of celebrations that and you can say on one hand, they ponder the whole issue of nostalgia, and yet on the other hand, they become a tool for allowing us to tell the story. And so there's a certain sense when your lecture is a bit confusing to me because you've pointed out a problem, but I don't actually hear an agenda or an answer that gives me the opportunity to go back to my church and say, here's the problem, but also here is an approach that helps us to move into the transformational transaction that you're trying to get us to engage. So my question is, how does celebration, which is nostalgic, help us to tell the story in a new way that creates transformation?
I'm happy to start. Thanks for your question, Frank. I mean, I'm very aware that I don't know yet. Like, I mean, I hope that's kind of obvious. Like, I don't know yet. I only got to kind of, you get to this point and then you say, now what? And I'm not exactly sure. But I have been thinking a lot about, say, for the last year or so. I think we're talking about the same thing, but I've been using the language of ritual. Because, you know, and Steve mentioned baptism, for example. I would see that as something different from nostalgia. It might make me nostalgic for my baptism when I'm at a baptism, but it should do more than that, right? There's something in the theological composition of the church, in the Spirit of God, that it elicits a movement of the Spirit in my own heart and life when I'm participating in the body where another believer is being baptized into the body, right? So I think that's more than nostalgia. My nostalgia might be the human side of it, but there's something bigger than that going on. And I'm really helped by my Indigenous friends actually at Nate's. And there was one gentleman, his name is going to just fly right in my head right now, but I'm going to think of it. And he did a paper last summer here on how we understand ritual. And I found it hugely enlightening because the way that the indigenous folks, some of them understand ritual is there's something that happens, an experience that happens, and you can't quite give it a language, but you can give it a practice, right? And so you engage in the ritual that then gives that meaning, and then you can talk about it. And I'm doing a terrible injustice to the description of it. But I went away from that thinking, wow, if we could get something about ritual as churches, I think there's something really deep and wonderful in that, where the rest of us can connect to that thing. So we have that sense of being connected to it without it being simply nostalgic. Does that make sense? And so ritual, I think there's all kinds of points, for example, of points of our existence where our identity could actually be remade and retold in the light of Christian ritual. But we don't have rituals so much. I mean, a friend told about when his children came of age as adults, and they had a naming ceremony where they're given a new name based on the personality that they've exhibited and all the things. And the whole community comes and they spend all weekend pouring into those young adults for the next stage of their life. I mean, we have so much to learn, I think, about what we could do that moves us beyond this is the way we've done it, this is how we understand it. And as soon as we do it that way again, we're caught up in our memories of it, rather than in that big, powerful, wild act of God and what he's doing in the life of that person and in the congregation as a whole. So I don't know if that helps at all, Frank, but it's a response.
Can I just add one sort of encouragement, really, and that is, I think one of the most important things is just to ask the question that you just asked. So I think that, for example, I have, through the years, visited a number of churches where they've asked me to preach at their anniversary service. So this is a celebration, or maybe a roll call service, but their anniversary service. And I would say I've seen two different types of services. I've seen churches where the focus is completely on nostalgia, completely on the past. And I've seen other churches where they've said, it's our anniversary service. What can we learn from the past that will help us to celebrate as we look to the future? And so I think many churches simply don't ask the question. We're going to have a celebration. How do we make sure that it's more than nostalgia? Again, for one other quick little illustration, and if you've been a student in my class, I apologize because you've heard this a dozen times. But one of the things I enjoyed doing as a pastor was going to every group in the church and just passing them a piece of blank paper and saying, what is your purpose for the coming year and how does it relate to evangelism? And having, whether it's deacons or trustees or the Women's Missionary Society or Sunday school teachers or the decorating committee or the social committee, having them take time to ask, what does this have to do with the mission of the church? As opposed to it just being, a celebration that has no purpose to it, really, that's in any way related to the gospel.
Hi. I'm intrigued by what you said earlier about people from Asia or whatever come and ask you the question. I just read a report from Statistics Canada. As of now, 1/4 of Canadians, they are not born in Canada. And to look forward, not nostalgia, to look forward, 2036, I hope most of us will still be alive. Half to more than half of Canadians, either they are not born in Canada or their parents was not born in Canada. My question is, what do you propose our evangelism strategy to be? And how well our theology, hermeneutics, in these kind of training and actually our thought be changed in 2036?
Well, again, I'll say a couple quick things. The first is come to my session tomorrow because we will talk about some ways to reach out. So again, I want to talk about hospitality a fair amount tomorrow in the session. I really think that's a key thing. But the strongest thing I would say this afternoon is, I think it's really important that we not respond with fear. And that's what I see too often, is people hear this, they think, oh my goodness. Well, the truth is, we are simply returning to normal. So before the baby boomers, always since Confederation, most Canadians had not been born in Canada. Just the baby boomer bubble went through, and that gave us one cohort of people so that more Canadians were being born here than elsewhere. But we're returning to normal. The only difference is that previously, those not born in Canada were mostly born in Europe. And so now we're having people who are born in Asia and Africa and South America coming in numbers that were not as prevalent before. So it does mean that we're looking at people who have grown up in parts of the world where Christianity is a minority religion. It means that a lot of the people coming have other religious backgrounds. Having said that, if you look at some of Reg Bibby's work, he suggested that the people who are coming to Canada, for example, from Muslim countries, tend not to be the most convinced Muslims. And that in fact people of other religious faiths are actually quite open to Christianity. So I think, again, the biggest concern I have is if we respond with fear, we've simply put up fences that mean those people will never come to Christ because they'll never hear the gospel from us. We need instead to be thinking, I think, with faith and with enthusiasm even. As I say in my class, God's bringing the mission field to us. Like, here we are. We were being a little too slow in going to other parts of the world, so God is sending them right here to us. We need to respond in ways that show the kind of faith that I think churches had when we sent missionaries to other parts of the world with the expectation that God was going to do great things.
Can I add a really, you know me, I'm like sometimes the most not practical person in the world, and because I kind of live in the realm of ideas, but I think it would be really great if our churches took hold of learning cultural intelligence. You know, I was going to say that, right? I mean, if we could learn cultural intelligence, diversity education, all of that stuff to help us deal with the potential fear of the unknown and all of that. And these tools are readily available and well done. And I just think it would be an easy thing to start with to prepare us for, because, you know, in the East, we lag behind. The world's changed elsewhere. It's changed in St. John, hasn't reached Wolfville quite yet. But it has on campus, of course, because we're a hugely diverse town. But what does it mean to welcome people and to share the gospel in languages that people understand? I don't mean you have to then learn languages, but we have to learn a cultural language and realize how much of our faith is wrapped up in our culture.
Yeah. And again, I'm just going to add one more thing, and that is to go back to the nostalgia piece. When we're thinking about people who come from different religious backgrounds, how unwilling are we to let go of some of our nostalgia that becomes a barrier? So all of the symbols and things that have great meaning for us because they represent Canadian Christianity of the last 200 years, but mean hopefully nothing or worse become barriers for people of other faith backgrounds who come to Canada and don't understand what this means for them. Are we willing to let go of some of those things in order to cross some of those barriers? Those are hard questions.
A question from online. For those in the room who may not know, we are live streaming these events. We have about 60 people watching everywhere from Wolfville and Port Williams and Halifax, but also as far as Las Vegas and New Zealand even. So welcome to everyone around the world. The question that came in, Steve, was a little bit kind of around your conversation when you were sharing about, are we expecting to see growth? And one person sent me a message and said, well, it is budget season for churches, and practically, how does that play out? I had asked the question online, did your church plan for growth or decline in the congregation and budget? Given your experience, how do you even begin to approach that, trying to balance being practical and prudent in financial planning, but also leaving the door open to actually expect growth and maybe the implications financially for a church?
So that's a complex question, I think, because often when people ask that question, they simply are asking, so if we really believe that God is going to do things, should we increase our budget by 20% this year and believe that all those people are going to come, they're all going to have offering envelopes or sign up for online giving or whatever? And I don't think that's really the way to look at it. I think obviously we need some wisdom. But I think instead we need to ask ourselves, what's in the budget? So I think for many churches, the budget doesn't have much mission in it. The budget tends to be mostly the bills that have to be paid and the pastor's salary. and with very little. So my concern is not so much to say, should we be adding another 10% to the budget, believing God is going to grow our church, is to back up and say, well, what's in our budget that shows that we have faith? What's in our budget that shows that we believe we should be carrying out a mission? Is there anything in our budget for reaching out to new Canadians, for example? Is there money in our budget to allow some hospitality events where we would invite people of different cultures? So what are the things that are in the budget? So I think that's the question first, is to ask, do we, again, this is the hard question in Atlantic Canada, I know, but how much of our budget is spent maintaining a building that may really be an albatross instead of a resource? And again, I know we love our buildings, so I say that carefully and realizing that we need to almost provide grief counseling for people in many of our congregations. But I look at congregations that are spending unbelievable amounts of money on maintaining a structure that's 150 years old, that has no spaces that really are effective for ministry or mission in today's world, and then have no money left over for mission. So I think those are hard questions that have to be asked as well. And believe me, I'm not saying that every church should be bulldozed or anything. Probably some should, but what I do think is that every church should be asking those questions in this time of great social transition. Is a traditional church building something that any congregation is going to want to have 20 years from now? And I'm not sure.
Hi, Chuck McGuire. Nostalgia, and you were talking about it in regards to buildings, and we were talking in regard to practices. I've been encountering a lot of that because there seems to be a sense that if we are no longer valuing those things now, they obviously must have not had any value then. And so it becomes a sense of dismissal, hurtful dismissal, because we think we've tied that together somehow. I see it a lot, and I don't know how actually to work from that exactly. One of the other things I've discovered is that many of those practices for which we have become nostalgic, they don't work for a variety of reasons: aging populations, less volunteers, whatever. But the purposes that they were put in place for then, those purposes are still real and true and practical for people, because they were for ministry, they were for evangelism, they were for fellowship, they were for discipleship. We still want all of those things. And how do we help people to see the background that still must remain and put a new layer on that for our current culture and the people we're trying to reach today?
Let me just say something quickly here. So again, I'll try to give you two lenses here. First is, I remember going to a church, I'd done a survey, and they asked me if I could come and talk about my results. And they needed to get out of their building. I mean, it was an extreme case where their building was in severe disrepair. All of their money and more was going into that building. And I remember one woman saying to me, she said, we cannot get rid of this building. This building is my husband. She said, he was the chair of the trustees. She said, when I go around this building, she said, this is not just the building where my husband worked, this is him. When the roof leaked, he was up there patching it. When something needed to be fixed, he was here fixing it. This is my husband. You can't. So, the church closed, and actually the building has been bulldozed now. I think, though, of churches, and again, I'll give the example of the church that I attend, because I think Rob Nowlin did a tremendous job. Main Street Baptist Church, a historic, amazing building. And I think Rob did a great job of emphasizing the faith that the people must have had to build a structure like that in the 1800s. and how much of a priority it must have been for them to carry out a mission in the north end of St. John, to put the resources they would have had to put into a building of that size and so on. And to say that we want to honor their faith by having that kind of faith today also as we move forward, as we recognize the building that they built in the 1800s is no longer functional for us. But the faith that they had is something that we want to carry on and honor. So I think that we can do that. We don't want to trivialize it. We don't want to suggest that the past is a bad thing. But we don't want to get stuck in the past. We want to recognize that our heritage is not a building. Our heritage is the gospel. It's like, the Romans 11. I mean, it's all these people of faith, this great cloud of witnesses that still continues today. And we want to honor that. That's not nostalgia. That's recognizing that the baton has been passed.
And if I could just say one or two things, I think that part of understanding Sehnsucht as this longing and nostalgia, that Lewis helps us to understand that there is this habit of idolizing the thing itself rather than the force within, the longing within it, the joy within it. And I think that there are ways of helping people to acknowledge and to celebrate that particular expression of capital J, joy, in that time. And to help them to realize that that was legitimate and wonderful and it was great, but to be able to see but still that was their experience of that bigger thing that people experience differently now. And so that the common thread is that the Spirit of God uses it all and pulls us all together in that direction. They moved things forward for their time. They were faithful, I hope. Maybe not everywhere in all times, but they were faithful for their time, and we couldn't have faith. We couldn't have inherited faith without them doing their part. But it just needs to look different from how it did before, without diminishing. I think that's the thing. It's easy to diminish what came before, and I don't want to dismiss everything as nostalgia, because I mean, in the definition of nostalgia, the idea is that you come to idolize in a way that thing rather than the spirit that gave it life. And even though that thing is now done, over, dead, except that it lives in your heart and memory. Whereas if we talk about something like baptism or a church or whatever, it doesn't just live in our memory. It's a living thing of which we are part. Yeah. Thank you.
Couple of online questions. Maybe this one, Anna, for you. Comes in from Facebook, from Kirby. He asks, as we forge forward to make the church relevant, is the church headed to or willing to relinquish the exclusive ideas that the church and Jesus is the only way? In other words, is there a movement? Is there a place? Is there a trajectory for religious pluralism, cultural acceptance in this 21st century church that is forming?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I'm teaching a course this term about, theology in pluralistic context, so it kind of needs more than a 2-minute response. But I would say this. I think part of existing as Christians in a pluralistic context is holding on to our that in a pluralistic world where public space is shared, we have a couple of choices. Either we say that therefore we no longer are willing or able to make an exclusive claim in any way, or we say that, and then you don't have an evangelism. I don't know if you have an evangelism if you say that. Or you say that in public space, no one is allowed there. And I think we all have come to recognize that's not workable as a society. Or you say it's a space where everybody is welcome, and I would advocate for that. Complete religious freedom, and religious freedom for the Sikh, for the Buddhist, for the Muslim, and for the Christian. And for the Christian, that means that we hang on to our call to go and make disciples of all nations, and do that without, apologizing for that. I can't apologize that this is part of the mission of who we are as the disciples of Jesus Christ. But I also don't need to go around telling other people they don't belong or they're not welcome or I need to hit them over the head. I think learning to live in that public space in a pluralistic age is one of our huge challenges. And we're used to either dominating and being authoritative in that space, or we're used to shying away, saying we're not welcome here, we're pushed away. And we don't have a lot of confidence. And I think we ought to have every confidence for standing in that space and saying, we're Christians. This is what we believe. And I think that this is a great time actually for that. And I find myself in lots of different public spaces where people want to talk about stuff. They want to be able to talk about God and about Jesus with people who actually believe what they say they believe. And I think that's potentially a great time for us as the church as we learn to step into that space with a degree of confidence.
Just the follow-up statement as he's listening to you, he says, unfortunately, evangelism has been laced with racism. So with more clarity, are we willing to relinquish the racism that has been merged with Christian doctrine?
Yeah, I think a big part of this, of course, alludes back to when I was talking about insider Jesus. Part of the insider movement is driven by the idea that evangelism has so often been tied up with colonialism and white agenda and those things. And I think in many cases that's been true. And so an insider movement can be very welcome for that reason. But I think we have to recognize, too, that the Church of Jesus Christ is not white. And the white church has been racist. So we have to acknowledge that reality. But the best thing we can do in confronting our own racism as the white church in North America is to look at the church global and say, the vast majority of Christians live in the global south and they're not white. So does he have a comeback or follow up? Or
I'm sure he does,
Kirby,
but it's
if
not
that
here.
helps
Yeah.
Or not.
Steve, a question for you from Paul. Paul says, in a new book entitled Rethink Communication, the author states that the people who physically attend our churches attend 8 to 10 times a year. The people in our community who are trying to communicate to are on social media 115 minutes per day. Can you comment on the correlation?
Well, my comment would simply be to say, as I've already said, we're in a time of massive transition in our society, and we're not at the end of that transition yet. And the way that we expect people to use their time, the way we expect people to connect with other people is changing, and that change has not ended yet. How we will be social creatures 20 years from now, 50 years from now, I don't think we know. I don't think we can forecast. But I think we can know that it's going to be different than it is now, and now is very different than it was 20 years ago. So my comment is we need to be learning, we need to be watching, we need to be seeking to understand how are the best ways to be community. And community is not always going to be people in the same room in the way that we are used to. I don't think that means that we should neglect community in the same room, but it also means if we're going to reach new people, we've got to realize that many times it's not going to come from being in the same room with them, at least to begin with.